Once, there stood a city greater than any other in the Christian world, a city of emperors who believed themselves the rightful heirs to ancient Rome. For more than 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire withstood wars, plagues, revolts, and deep divisions in faith. Yet, despite its remarkable endurance, its story remains unfamiliar to many. Why did this Eastern Roman Empire outlive the Western one by nearly a millennium? And what ultimately brought about its fall? This is the complete tale of the Byzantine Empire. Let's begin. In the early 4th century CE, the Roman Empire found itself at a critical turning point. After centuries of relentless expansion, civil strife, and constant power struggles, the empire had become too vast and too complex to manage effectively. Its domains stretched from the stormy shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, and from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Tigris River. Ruling such an immense and diverse realm from one city, Rome, had grown nearly impossible. Even Rome itself, once the pulsating heart of imperial might, was no longer ideally positioned to govern such a sprawling empire. The man who recognized this reality and chose to act upon it was Flavius Valerius Constantinus, remembered by history as Constantine the Great. Born in the late 3rd century in what is now Serbia, Constantine rose through the military ranks amid fierce political rivalries that had torn the empire apart. By the year 324 CE, he had defeated all his rivals and emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world. But Constantine's ambition extended beyond simply restoring old Roman order. He sought to reshape it entirely. His reign marked the dawn of a new era in Roman history, one characterized by a stronger imperial presence in the east and a closer alliance between the state and the rising Christian faith. Among Constantine's most significant achievements was the establishment of a new imperial capital. He chose the ancient Greek settlement of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait, as the site where Rome would be reborn. This choice was no coincidence. Byzantium stood at the very crossroads of Europe and Asia, with access to both the Aegean and Black Seas. Its position offered control over vital trade and military routes, particularly those in the eastern provinces, regions rich in wealth, culture, and population. The decision also mirrored Constantine's vision for a Christian empire. Rome, tied to its pagan traditions and senatorial aristocracy, symbolized the old world. His new city would represent a Christian future, unburdened by Rome's ancient institutions. In founding this city, Constantine wasn't merely creating a new administrative center. He was forging a new imperial identity. Construction began around 324 CE. Massive walls enclosed the peninsula. Aqueducts carried fresh water, and grand churches arose as symbols of the empire's shifting faith. In 330 CE, the city was officially dedicated as Nova Roma, New Rome. Yet, it quickly became known by another name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This moment did not signal the end of Rome, but rather a gradual transfer of power and prestige. While Rome retained immense symbolic weight, Constantinople rapidly became the empire's beating heart, a center of politics, trade, faith, and influence. Constantine's reforms went far beyond the founding of a city. He overhauled the empire's finances by introducing the gold solidus, a stable coin that would dominate international trade for centuries. He reorganized the military into flexible field units capable of rapid deployment across frontiers. And most significantly, he secured Christianity's legal protection. In 313 CE, through the Edict of Milan, Constantine granted religious freedom to Christians and returned their confiscated properties. 2 years later, he convened the Council of Nicaea, which laid the groundwork for defining Christian orthodoxy. By supporting the church both politically and financially, Constantine ensured that Christianity would become permanently woven into the empire's destiny. It's crucial to understand that these changes didn't arise in isolation. The Roman Empire had already been evolving for centuries. The 3rd century had been marked by chaos, civil wars, invasions, and economic breakdowns. Earlier emperors, like Diocletian, had already divided the empire into eastern and western halves to improve governance. Constantine built upon these foundations, but took them much further by relocating the seat of power entirely. As Constantinople grew, it reflected the grand vision of its founder, a city of marble palaces, bustling marketplaces, magnificent churches, and towering fortifications. Modeled after Rome with its own Senate and chariot racetrack, it nonetheless looked eastward, toward a new world. Latin remained the official language of administration for a time, but as centuries passed, Greek would become the dominant tongue of everyday life. By the time Constantine died in 337 CE, his new capital was already flourishing. Successive emperors expanded its walls, increased its population, and cemented its role as the true seat of imperial power. Constantine was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by 12 empty sarcophagi, symbolizing the 12 apostles, a gesture that portrayed him not just as a ruler of men, but as a servant of divine purpose. The founding of Constantinople was more than an act of political strategy or urban planning. It marked the birth of a new Roman identity. This city would serve as the heart of an empire that would endure long after the Western Roman Empire crumbled. Its fortifications would withstand countless invasions, its scholars would preserve ancient knowledge, and its emperors would continue to rule in the name of Augustus and Constantine, proclaiming themselves the rightful heirs of Rome. By the mid-5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was in its final, desperate decline. Repeated invasions, political infighting, and economic collapse had shattered its foundations. The western half, once the cradle of Roman civilization, was falling apart piece by piece. The end finally came in 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. With that act, imperial authority in the West vanished. Yet, the Roman Empire did not disappear. It simply shifted. In the East, the empire endured, ruled from Constantinople, governed by Roman law, and still claiming the legacy of Augustus and Constantine. For many living in the eastern provinces, the events in Italy felt distant and irrelevant. The emperor still reigned. The courts still functioned. The Roman state, though changed, had survived. Modern historians call this surviving state the Byzantine Empire, but its own people did not. They continued to call themselves Romans. Their emperors ruled with the same imperial titles. Their laws remained rooted in Roman tradition, and their administration still reflected the grandeur of the ancient empire. Yet over time, its culture and outlook began to transform. In practical terms, the East was far stronger than the West had ever been. Its provinces, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, were wealthier, more urbanized, and intricately connected through trade. Constantinople itself was almost impenetrable, surrounded by the sea on three sides and defended by massive triple-layered walls that would become legendary. Moreover, the Eastern emperors controlled richer tax bases and more disciplined armies, giving them the means to sustain imperial rule long after Rome's fall. The man ruling the East at the time of the Western collapse was Emperor Zeno. His reign was turbulent, marked by internal revolts and religious disputes, but the very fact that he managed to hold the throne was an achievement. When Odoacer overthrew Romulus Augustulus, he did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he formally recognized Zeno as the sole Roman ruler. Though symbolic, this gesture reflected a deeper truth. The East had become the true heart of Rome. Still, the loss of the West presented a double-edged reality. On one hand, the Eastern Empire no longer had to compete with rival emperors in cities like Ravenna or Milan. On the other, it now carried the full weight of Roman legitimacy, the claim to be the one, true continuation of the empire. Yet much of the former Roman world was now beyond its grasp. This new reality would shape Byzantine identity for centuries, the conviction that the empire was universal, destined to rule all Christians and all Romans, even if, in practice, it could no longer do so. As the West disappeared, Constantinople's imperial court became increasingly powerful. The emperor's palace turned into a political universe of its own, filled with bureaucrats, eunuchs, courtiers, and ambitious generals. These officials managed the machinery of state, and the closer they were to the emperor, the greater their influence. Intrigue and plotting became constant features of Byzantine politics, where a whisper or betrayal could change the course of an empire. At the same time, religion was reshaping the empire from within. The 4th and 5th centuries saw fierce theological disputes within Christianity, debates over Christ's nature and the boundaries of orthodoxy that continued long after Constantine's death. These controversies, particularly between Chalcedonian Christians and Monophysites, stirred deep unrest in key provinces such as Egypt and Syria. Emperors could not stand apart from such matters. They were seen not just as secular rulers, but as defenders of the faith, responsible for preserving divine truth. This fusion of church and state became a defining trait of Byzantine rule, but it also meant that theological disagreements often turned into political crises. Despite these tensions, the Eastern Roman Empire remained a model of order and endurance. Its tax system, though burdensome, kept the treasury filled. Its provincial governors, usually drawn from the educated elite, maintained local stability. The army was smaller than Rome's of old, but disciplined and professional. Strategically, the empire kept its focus on the eastern frontier, where its ancient rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire, stood as both trading partner and mortal threat. Relations between Byzantium and Persia were centuries old, marked by alternating cycles of war and uneasy peace. They traded goods, exchanged ambassadors, and occasionally arranged political marriages, but mutual suspicion never faded. Each saw the other as the only power capable of destroying it. Still, for a time, both empires maintained a fragile balance, until new dangers began to rise from beyond their traditional borders. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, new powers emerged on the edges of the old Roman world. From the north, waves of Germanic tribes and steppe warriors advanced into former Roman territories. The Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, established a kingdom in Italy. The Vandals seized North Africa. The Visigoths ruled parts of Spain. These were not mere raiders. They were founders of new states built upon Roman ruins. The Byzantine Empire's reaction was cautious. It did not rush to reclaim these lands. Instead, it relied on diplomacy, treaties, and even bribes to maintain influence. The empire's leaders were pragmatic, focused more on preserving stability than chasing the ghosts of past glory. But that would soon change. In the early 6th century, a new emperor rose in Constantinople with a vision that would redefine the empire's destiny. He dreamed of reconquering Rome's lost lands, restoring imperial power, and uniting the Christian world under one rule. His name was Justinian, later remembered as Justinian the Great, and his reign would mark one of the most ambitious and transformative chapters in Byzantine history. At the dawn of the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire stood on the edge of renewal. From its capital in Constantinople would emerge a ruler whose ambition knew no limits, Emperor Justinian, later known to history as Justinian the Great. His reign became one of the most defining, dynamic, and far-reaching eras in all of Byzantine history. Through conquest, reform, and monumental creation, Justinian sought nothing less than to restore the glory of ancient Rome. Born around 482 CE in the Balkan province of Dardania, Justinian came from modest beginnings. His uncle, Justin, served in the imperial guard and eventually rose through the ranks to become emperor. When Justin took the throne in 518 CE, he brought his bright and determined nephew to Constantinople, giving him a privileged education in law, theology, and imperial governance, the perfect preparation for power. Upon Justin's death in 527 CE, Justinian ascended to the throne. From the very start, he set out to transform the empire. His goals were immense: to reclaim the western provinces lost to barbarian kingdoms, to strengthen central authority, and to unify the empire under one faith. Achieving this vision required enormous resources, loyal administrators, and skilled military leadership. For that, Justinian relied on one of the greatest generals of the ancient world, Belisarius. Under Belisarius's command, the Byzantine army embarked on a series of daring campaigns to recover the old Roman territories. The first target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. In 533 CE, Belisarius led a fleet across the Mediterranean, defeating the Vandals with stunning speed and restoring the wealthy province of Carthage to imperial control. Emboldened by this success, Justinian turned his gaze to Italy, then ruled by the Ostrogoths. In 535 CE, Belisarius launched the Gothic War, a long and brutal conflict that would last nearly 20 years. He captured Rome and Ravenna, but the war dragged on as new Gothic leaders rose to resist. By the end, the Byzantines had won, but at enormous cost. Italy lay in ruins, its cities scarred by years of relentless warfare. Meanwhile, the empire was also engaged in battles along its eastern frontier with the Sassanid Persians. These wars produced mixed results, but demonstrated Justinian's determination to defend, and when possible, expand his borders on multiple fronts. Yet Justinian's vision extended far beyond military conquest. His most enduring achievement came through law. Centuries of Roman legislation had become vast, disorganized, and often contradictory. Determined to bring order to this chaos, Justinian commissioned the brilliant jurist Tribonian in 529 CE to compile and reform the entire body of Roman law. The result was the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This four-part codification, the Codex Justinianus, Digest, Institutes, and later Novelli, did more than tidy up old statutes. It unified and systematized Roman legal thought, laying down a foundation that would influence not only Byzantine administration, but the development of civil law throughout Europe for centuries to come. Even modern legal systems still bear traces of Justinian's code. Religiously, Justinian saw himself as the protector of orthodoxy, a ruler chosen by God to preserve the true faith. He used imperial power to promote religious unity, actively persecuting heretical sects such as Arians, Monophysites, and remaining pagans. However, his efforts often caused as much division as unity. The question of Christ's nature, human, divine, or both, continued to divide Christian communities, particularly in Egypt and Syria, where Monophysitism remained deeply rooted. Justinian's insistence on enforcing Chalcedonian doctrine alienated many and left wounds that would weaken imperial unity for generations. Still, despite these internal strains, Justinian's reign was a golden age of art, architecture, and culture. Nowhere was this more evident than in his greatest architectural triumph, the Hagia Sophia. After the old church was destroyed during the Nika riots, a massive uprising that nearly toppled Justinian himself, he ordered an even grander basilica to be built. Completed in 537 CE, the Hagia Sophia stood as a marvel of engineering and faith, its massive dome seeming to float above the city like a vision of heaven itself. For nearly 1,000 years, it would remain the most important church in Eastern Christendom, a symbol of Byzantine power and divine majesty. But the Hagia Sophia's creation was born from one of the darkest moments of Justinian's rule, the Nika riots of 532 CE. The unrest began as clashes between rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and Greens, in Constantinople's Hippodrome. What started as a sports rivalry spiraled into full-scale rebellion. The city erupted in flames. Rioters demanded the emperor's abdication and even proclaimed a new ruler. Justinian considered fleeing, but his wife, the formidable Empress Theodora, refused. Once an actress of humble origins, Theodora had risen to become empress and Justinian's most trusted advisor. According to legend, she told her husband, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Her courage changed the course of history. Emboldened by her words, Justinian stayed. He ordered Belisarius and another general to storm the Hippodrome, where tens of thousands of rebels had gathered. The result was a massacre, but it saved the empire. The rebellion was crushed, and imperial authority reasserted. Theodora's influence in court went far beyond this episode. She advised Justinian on state policy, advocated for social reforms, and worked to improve the status of women and the poor. Her partnership with the emperor became one of the most remarkable political alliances in Byzantine history, a union of power, intelligence, and resilience. By the end of Justinian's reign, the Byzantine Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent in centuries. It controlled large parts of Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain, in addition to its long-held eastern provinces. Yet this triumph came at a heavy cost. The treasury was drained, cities were devastated, and the population suffered under the burdens of war and taxation. When Justinian died in 565 CE, he left behind a transformed empire, grander in vision but strained in reality. To his admirers, he was a second Constantine, a visionary who restored Roman greatness. To his critics, he was an overreacher whose ambition overextended the empire's limits and deepened its divisions. And yet, even as his monumental project stood gleaming across the empire, an unseen enemy was about to descend, one that would bring death, devastation, and lasting change to Byzantium. It began in the year 541 CE, and it would be remembered as the plague of Justinian. In the midst of Justinian's grand vision to restore Rome's lost splendor, an invisible and deadly force emerged, one that would bring the Byzantine Empire to its knees. In 541 CE, a mysterious and devastating pandemic swept through the eastern Mediterranean, halting Justinian's expansion and plunging the empire into crisis. This event, remembered as the Plague of Justinian, became one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, reshaping the empire's future in ways no army or rebellion ever could. The outbreak is believed to have begun in Egypt, then one of Byzantium's richest provinces and its primary source of grain. From there, the disease followed the empire's intricate trade routes, traveling by ship and caravan toward the imperial capital. By the spring of 541 CE, it reached Constantinople, a city teeming with life, commerce, and faith, and within weeks, it began to die. The plague overwhelmed the city not through siege or sword, but through fear and decay. Constantinople's defenses, its walls and armies, were useless against an enemy too small to see. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness to the catastrophe, described the horror in chilling detail. At its peak, he wrote, as many as 5,000 people died every day. Some accounts even claimed 10,000 deaths daily. Corpses filled the streets. Graves overflowed. The stench of death hung in the air. Public order broke down as the living struggled to bury the dead. Modern science identifies the disease as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same that would later fuel the Black Death in the 14th century. Carried by fleas on rats, it spread swiftly through the densely packed urban quarters of the empire's cities. No one was spared. The rich and the poor, nobles and slaves, soldiers and priests, all fell alike. Even Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague. Though he survived, his recovery was slow, and his vitality never fully returned. The empire, however, suffered far worse. Scholars estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Constantinople's population perished. Across the empire, tens of millions died as wave after wave of infection swept through the Mediterranean world. The consequences were catastrophic. Entire villages disappeared. Farms lay abandoned. Harvests failed. Tax revenues collapsed as landowners and peasants alike succumbed. With fewer soldiers, the army struggled to defend the empire's borders. Cities shrank, trade routes faltered, and the once thriving urban economy withered. The Byzantine state, famed for its efficiency and bureaucracy, was paralyzed. The imperial administration, dependent on scribes, officials, and governors, could not function properly when so many were dead or dying. Messages went unanswered, orders went unenforced, and local governments fell into disarray. Communication between Constantinople and the provinces became sporadic, and the once orderly empire began to fracture from within. Trade and commerce also ground to a halt. Merchants avoided infected ports, caravans ceased to travel. Grain shipments, vital for feeding Constantinople, became unreliable. Shortages and inflation followed. Labor was scarce, prices soared, and the social fabric of the empire began to fray. In some places, entire estates collapsed as both masters and workers vanished. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological and spiritual toll was immense. Many believed the plague was divine punishment, a sign that God was angered with the emperor, the church, or humanity itself. Fear gripped the populace. Processions, prayers, and rituals filled the streets as desperate citizens sought forgiveness or protection. The clergy, often the first to comfort the sick and bury the dead, suffered enormous losses themselves. Many bishops and monks perished, leaving the church weakened, yet paradoxically more influential, as people turned to faith to make sense of the suffering. Despite the unimaginable devastation, the empire did not collapse. The Byzantine state, though gravely wounded, survived, a testament to its deep administrative roots and the resilience of its people. Yet, the world that emerged after the plague was fundamentally altered. The empire that once dreamed of reconquest became one more concerned with preservation. In the years following the pandemic, Justinian and his successors shifted focus inward. Military campaigns slowed. Resources once devoted to expansion were redirected toward rebuilding, repairing cities, fortifying walls, and resettling the countryside. Reconstruction began, but the scale of loss could not be undone. Economically, the empire never fully recovered its pre-plague vitality. The wars of reconquest had already drained its treasury. Now the labor shortages and loss of taxable land compounded the strain. The Great Gothic War in Italy had left the peninsula in ruins, and maintaining control over these distant territories became nearly impossible. In many areas, Byzantine authority weakened, paving the way for local rulers to assert independence, a foreshadowing of the fragmentation that would come in later centuries. The Eastern Front, too, grew unstable. The Sassanid Persians, though affected by the plague, recovered faster than Byzantium. Skirmishes resumed along the border, and the empire's depleted army found it increasingly difficult to hold its ground. Yet, despite these setbacks, Byzantium adapted in subtle but crucial ways. Taxes were eased in devastated regions to prevent rebellion. Monasteries, less reliant on the imperial system, became vital centers of charity and community life. Local landowners began to fill the void left by imperial administrators, taking on greater roles in maintaining order and rebuilding agriculture, early signs of the feudal structures that would later define medieval society. Culturally, the plague left a profound imprint on the Byzantine mind. Chroniclers, preachers, and theologians of the age wrote of divine wrath and mercy, of death and survival. The tone of Byzantine literature grew more introspective, aware of human fragility and divine mystery. By the mid-540s, the worst of the pandemic had passed, but the scars it left, demographic, economic, and spiritual, would endure for generations. Justinian still sat on the throne, but the emperor who had once dreamed of reconquering the world now ruled a shaken, diminished realm. The Hagia Sophia still glistened over Constantinople's skyline, and the Corpus Juris Civilis continued to shape law and governance. But the empire's boundaries were shrinking, its confidence shaken. The dream of restoration had faded into the harsh reality of survival. After the devastation of the plague in the mid-6th century, the Byzantine Empire emerged weakened and weary. Its population had been decimated, its economy strained, and its army severely depleted. Yet, the world beyond Byzantium did not pause to let it recover. New enemies and fresh challenges pressed in from all directions, from the deserts of the East to the forests of the Balkans. The empire, still reeling from internal loss, now faced a world that was rapidly changing. In the East, the old rivalry with the Sassanid Persian Empire flared up once more. The Persians, ruled by powerful monarchs such as Khosrow I and his successors, had rebounded from the effects of the plague faster than Byzantium. By the late 6th century, they began launching new offensives into Byzantine lands, exploiting the empire's weakened state. Among those who faced this renewed Persian aggression was Emperor Maurice, a capable and ambitious ruler who came to power near the century's end. Maurice inherited an empire under pressure. On the northern front, the Balkans were being invaded by a flood of new peoples, Avars, fierce nomadic warriors skilled in cavalry warfare, and Slavs, migrating agricultural tribes who gradually settled the region. To the east, Persian forces once again crossed the borders into Byzantine territory. To survive, Maurice needed both military skill and political cunning. He tried to stabilize the Balkans through a mix of warfare and diplomacy, winning temporary peace by forging alliances and paying off some enemies while fighting others. In the east, he achieved several impressive victories against Persia, eventually securing favorable terms that restored imperial control over key regions. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might recover its strength. But Maurice's success came at a cost. His constant military campaigns and strict fiscal discipline made him unpopular with both the army and the populace. When discontent boiled over, he was overthrown in a military revolt, captured and executed, along with his sons. His fall plunged Byzantium into chaos. The man who seized power afterward was a general named Phocas. His rule marked one of the darkest periods in Byzantine history. Phocas was despised by both the army and the people. His reign was marked by brutality, instability, and widespread corruption. His coup also gave the Persians the perfect excuse to break their peace treaty. Using Maurice's murder as justification, the Persian king Khosrow II declared war on Byzantium, beginning one of the most destructive conflicts between the two empires. Persian armies swept deep into Byzantine lands, capturing Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. By the early 7th century, the Sassanids had advanced all the way to Chalcedon, just across the Bosporus from Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean, now stood on the brink of annihilation. The loss of Egypt was especially devastating. For centuries, it had been the empire's breadbasket, supplying the grain that fed Constantinople's vast population. Its fall struck at the heart of Byzantine survival. Meanwhile, internal religious divisions continued to weaken resistance. Many of the empire's eastern provinces, particularly Egypt and Syria, followed Monophysite Christianity and resented the theological dominance of Constantinople's Chalcedonian orthodoxy. To them, Persian occupation often seemed preferable to imperial oppression. Thus, when the Persians arrived, resistance in these regions was half-hearted at best. While the east burned, the Balkans descended into chaos. The Avars, a powerful confederation of horsemen from Central Asia, launched relentless raids into imperial territory. Alongside them came the Slavs, who slowly migrated into the depopulated lands south of the Danube. The Slavs, unlike the nomadic Avars, were settlers. They cleared forests, built villages, and gradually took root, transforming the Balkans' cultural and ethnic landscape. The once Romanized heartland of southeastern Europe was now changing forever. By the early 7th century, entire regions that had once flourished under Roman rule were abandoned or destroyed. Great cities became isolated fortresses. Byzantine administrators lost control over vast stretches of land. The empire, beset by enemies on all sides, had to rethink its priorities. With the West lost long ago, and the East collapsing under Persian conquest, survival now depended on defending Asia Minor, the empire's last true stronghold. Asia Minor, with its rugged mountains and fortified towns, became both a refuge and a fortress. It sheltered displaced populations from the fallen provinces of Egypt and Syria and supplied the empire's remaining soldiers. It was from here that Byzantium would mount its final stand. Out of this chaos rose a new leader, one who would restore hope to a dying empire. His name was Heraclius. When Emperor Heraclius took the throne in 610 CE, the Byzantine world was on the verge of collapse. The treasury was empty, the army demoralized, and the Persians occupied half the empire. Yet Heraclius proved to be one of Byzantium's most determined and resourceful rulers. He recognized that to save the state, he would have to rebuild it from the ground up. Heraclius began by reforming the empire's military and administrative systems. He laid the foundations for what would later be known as the theme system, dividing Asia Minor into military districts, each governed by a general responsible for both civil administration and defense. This allowed local armies to respond quickly to invasions without waiting for orders from the distant capital, a crucial innovation that would define Byzantine resilience for centuries. With his power consolidated and the empire reorganized, Heraclius launched an audacious counterattack. Between 622 and 627 CE, he led a series of lightning campaigns deep into Persian territory, a daring reversal of fortune. In 627 CE, at the Battle of Nineveh, Heraclius struck a decisive victory, crushing Persian resistance. Soon after, Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his own nobles, bringing peace at last. The Byzantines recovered their lost provinces, including Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, and for a brief, shining moment. It seemed that the empire had been reborn. But that triumph was fleeting. Years of continuous warfare had drained both Byzantium and Persia. Their treasuries were empty, their armies exhausted, and their people weary from endless conflict. From the south, in the deserts of Arabia, a new and unexpected power was rising, one that would transform the world and challenge Byzantium in ways neither empire had foreseen. Before that new chapter unfolds, it's worth remembering what Heraclius had accomplished. Against overwhelming odds, he had saved an empire that had seemed doomed to fall. His leadership demonstrated the Byzantine ability to adapt, to rebuild, reorganize, and endure. But the cost had been enormous. The wars left Byzantium battered and vulnerable, setting the stage for the next great challenge, the rise of Islam. When Emperor Heraclius returned victorious from his campaigns against Persia, he was celebrated as a savior. After decades of loss, Byzantium once again stood tall, its holy relics restored, and its enemies defeated. But even as the empire rejoiced, far to the south, a new force was awakening, one that would change the balance of power forever. In the Arabian Peninsula, tribes once divided by clan rivalries were uniting under a single faith, Islam. The teachings of the Prophet Muhammad inspired a spiritual and political movement unlike any the world had ever seen. Within just a few years of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Arab armies, driven by faith, discipline, and unity, surged out of Arabia, transforming the Middle East. At first, Byzantium scarcely noticed. The empire was exhausted, its army recovering, its finances shattered by years of war. Heraclius, now aging, had little reason to see the small desert tribes as a threat. But soon, reports began to reach Constantinople. Arab forces had crossed into Byzantine territory, striking swiftly across Syria and Palestine. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantine army faced the Arabs in a confrontation that would decide the fate of the East. Despite Heraclius's careful preparations, his troops were outmaneuvered by the brilliant Muslim general Khalid ibn al-Walid. The battle was catastrophic. The Byzantine army was annihilated, and the empire lost Syria, one of its richest and most ancient provinces. The defeat at Yarmouk shattered Byzantium's grip on the Middle East. One by one, its territories fell. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, surrendered in 638 CE. Egypt followed soon after, its grain fleets no longer sailing to Constantinople. In just a few decades, the empire that had once dominated the Mediterranean had lost the very lands that had sustained it for centuries. For the first time in history, the Byzantine Empire was forced to accept a fundamentally new reality. It was no longer a world empire, but a regional power. Its territory was now confined largely to Anatolia, the Balkans, and a few scattered holdings in Italy and North Africa. The loss was not just territorial, it was spiritual. The empire that saw itself as the guardian of Christian truth had been defeated by a rising new faith. Despite the crushing losses, Byzantium did not collapse. It adapted. Heraclius shifted his capital's focus toward the east, fortifying the defenses of Asia Minor, which would now serve as the empire's core. The administrative and military reforms he had introduced, the theme system, became vital in organizing defense. Local armies stationed throughout Anatolia allowed the Byzantines to respond swiftly to raids and invasions. It was this system that ensured Byzantium's survival in the centuries to come. The empire's resilience became one of its defining traits. Though the Arabs conquered vast territories, from Spain in the west to Persia in the east, they could not take Constantinople. Twice, massive Arab fleets and armies laid siege to the Byzantine capital, the first from 674 to 678 CE, and the second from 717 to 718 CE. Both times, the city's massive Theodosian walls and a secret weapon, Greek fire, saved it from destruction. Greek fire was one of the most fearsome inventions of the medieval world, a flammable liquid, projected from siphons, that ignited upon contact with water. Its exact composition remains a mystery even today. When Arab ships approached Constantinople's walls, Byzantine defenders unleashed torrents of Greek fire that engulfed enemy vessels in flames. The weapon turned the tide of both sieges. The Arab fleets retreated, and Constantinople, and Christianity survived. The defense of the capital during these sieges became legendary, shaping the empire's identity as the last bastion of the Roman world and the defender of the Christian faith. It was said that during the first siege, the Virgin Mary herself was seen protecting the city, an image that strengthened Byzantine conviction that their empire was preserved by divine favor. But even victory could not undo the empire's transformation. The Byzantine state that emerged from these centuries of turmoil was smaller, harder, and more focused. Gone was the cosmopolitan empire of Justinian's day, replaced by a leaner, militarized, and deeply religious state. Greek, not Latin, became the dominant language of government and culture, reflecting the empire's Eastern identity. This was no longer the old Roman Empire of the Caesars. It was now unmistakably Byzantine. Under Heraclius, the empire also underwent a profound religious shift. He attempted to heal the rift between Chalcedonian and Monophysite Christians by promoting a compromise doctrine called monothelitism, which claimed Christ had two natures, but one divine will. The plan backfired. Instead of uniting the church, it sparked new theological conflict. The divisions between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin West deepened further, foreshadowing the Great Schism that would later split Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches. By the time of Heraclius's death in 641 CE, the empire he had saved was unrecognizable. The Byzantines had lost their ancient heartlands in Syria and Egypt, yet they had survived the storm. Their endurance came not from power or wealth, but from adaptability, a willingness to reinvent themselves again and again. The empire was no longer Roman in the old sense. It was Christian, Greek, and fiercely resilient. For the next 2 centuries, the Byzantines would live under constant pressure, fighting not only the Muslims to the south, but also the Bulgars and Slavs in the north. Yet through it all, Constantinople endured. The empire that refused to die continued to adapt, to rebuild, and to hold fast to its belief that it was the one true heir of Rome. By the 8th century, the Byzantine Empire had survived the worst storms of invasion, plague, and near collapse. It was smaller and humbler than the empire of Justinian or Constantine, yet it remained remarkably alive, defended by its mighty walls, its disciplined armies, and a faith that had become both its greatest strength and its deepest source of conflict. But now, a new struggle was brewing, not from outside, but within. It was a battle over the soul of Byzantium itself, a conflict that would divide emperors, tear through churches, and shake the empire to its very foundations. This was the era of the iconoclast controversy. The Byzantines were a people of deep religious devotion. Their churches glittered with gold mosaics, their homes were filled with painted icons, and their prayers were often offered before images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. To them, icons were not idols, but windows to the divine, tangible links between heaven and earth. Yet not everyone agreed. By the early 700s, a growing faction, inspired by scriptural literalism and influenced by Islamic aniconism, began to question whether such images violated God's commandments against graven idols. The debate might have remained theological had it not reached the imperial palace itself. In 726 CE, Emperor Leo III, known as Leo the Isaurian, issued an edict banning the veneration of icons. To him, the empire's recent military defeats were divine punishment for idolatry, and purging images from churches would restore God's favor. Iconoclasm, the breaking of icons, had become official state policy. Monks, priests, and common citizens rose in protest. Many refused to abandon their beloved icons, seeing Leo's decree as blasphemy. Violence erupted across the empire. Mobs clashed in the streets, monasteries were raided, sacred images were smashed and burned. For more than a century, Byzantium was torn apart by this bitter struggle between iconoclasts, who rejected religious imagery, and iconodules, who defended it. Emperors and patriarchs took sides, each claiming divine authority. Under Leo's son, Constantine V, the persecution of icon worshippers intensified. Monks were tortured, exiled, and executed. Entire monastic communities were destroyed. And yet, even as the empire fractured spiritually, it endured militarily. Leo III and Constantine V reorganized the army, fortified the frontiers, and successfully repelled Arab invasions. In 740 CE, Byzantine forces won a decisive victory at Acres, halting the caliphate's advance into Asia Minor. For all their religious harshness, these emperors restored military stability, buying Byzantium precious time. Meanwhile, the conflict over icons continued to rage long after their deaths. In 787 CE, the Empress Irene, ruling as regent for her young son Constantine VI, sought to heal the wound that divided her people. She convened the Second Council of Nicaea, where bishops and theologians debated the issue once more. The council restored the veneration of icons, declaring that images were not to be worshipped, but to be honored, for the reverence shown to them passed to the holy figures they represented. For a time, peace returned, but not for long. A new wave of iconoclasm erupted in the 9th century, under Emperor Leo V and his successors. Once again, icons were banned, and once again, the empire was split in two. It was not until 843 CE, under Empress Theodora, that the policy was finally ended for good. The restoration of icons was celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy, a feast still honored in the Eastern Orthodox Church today. These centuries of turmoil left deep scars, but also forged a stronger spiritual identity. Byzantium emerged from the iconoclastic era more unified in faith, its theology refined, and its church firmly established as a defining pillar of imperial life. The empire's endurance through such fierce internal conflict revealed something extraordinary. Even when divided, Byzantium refused to collapse. With peace restored, the 9th and 10th centuries became a time of renewal, a cultural and political resurgence historians now call the Macedonian Renaissance. This revival began under Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, who came to power in 867 CE. Born of humble origins, possibly an Armenian peasant, Basil rose through charisma and cunning to become emperor. His reign marked the start of a golden era, a time of military strength, artistic brilliance, and intellectual rebirth. Under Basil and his successors, the empire's fortunes soared. The Byzantine army reconquered lost territories, pushing back Arab forces in the east and reclaiming Crete and Cyprus. In the Balkans, imperial armies advanced deep into Bulgaria, reasserting Byzantine dominance in the region. Trade flourished once again. Constantinople regained its status as the wealthiest and most dazzling city in the known world, its streets filled with merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and envoys from distant lands. Art and learning blossomed. The imperial court sponsored grand mosaics, illuminated manuscripts, and theological works that blended classical Greek philosophy with Christian thought. Scholars like Photius, the learned patriarch of Constantinople, preserved ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. In monasteries and scriptoria, scribes copied and commented on works of Aristotle, Plato, and the Church Fathers, keeping the flame of ancient knowledge alive through the Middle Ages. The Macedonian emperors also strengthened the imperial bureaucracy, refining laws and codifying administration. Under Leo VI the Wise, a new legal code, the Basilica, reorganized Justinian's laws into Greek and made them accessible to a wider audience. The empire's governance became more professional, efficient, and centralized, the mark of a state that had learned to survive through discipline and adaptability. By the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire was once again a superpower, smaller than Rome's vast dominion, yet far more stable and sophisticated. Its armies stood among the best in the world, its culture glittered with refinement, and its faith gave it unshakable purpose. Constantinople, with its golden domes and towering walls, was the beating heart of a civilization that had outlasted all its ancient rivals. But beneath the glory, new threats were stirring, from the rising power of the Seljuk Turks in the east to ambitious kings and crusaders in the west. Byzantium had endured every storm so far, but greater trials still lay ahead, tests that would decide not just its strength, but its very survival. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood at the height of its second golden age. Its armies were powerful, its cities prosperous, and its culture more refined than ever. Constantinople gleamed like a crown above the Bosporus, a city of marble palaces, golden domes, and bustling marketplaces where merchants from every corner of the world gathered. For the first time in centuries, it seemed the empire had regained the stability and splendor of its ancient past. Under Emperor Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, Byzantium reached the peak of its medieval might. His long reign, from 976 to 1025 CE, was one of relentless military success and iron-fisted rule. Basil crushed the Bulgarian Empire after decades of warfare, finally annexing Bulgaria into the Byzantine realm. His victories extended imperial control deep into the Balkans, and his disciplined reforms kept the army strong and loyal. When Basil II died, the Byzantine Empire stretched from southern Italy to Armenia and from the Danube to the deserts of Syria. Yet his death marked the end of an era, for no one could match his strength or vision. In the decades that followed, weak rulers, political intrigue, and growing corruption slowly eroded the stability he had built. Wealthy aristocrats began to dominate provincial lands, draining the treasury's income and weakening central authority. The once formidable military system, the themes, began to decay as local farmers were replaced by mercenaries, loyal not to the emperor, but to whoever paid them best. Meanwhile, a new and formidable power was rising in the east, the Seljuk Turks. Originally nomadic horsemen from Central Asia, the Seljuks had embraced Islam and forged a vast empire that quickly overran Persia and pushed deep into Byzantine territory. In 1071 CE, their advance culminated in one of Byzantium's most disastrous defeats, the Battle of Manzikert. At Manzikert, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led his forces to confront the Seljuks, but internal betrayal sealed his fate. Rival generals deserted the battlefield, and the Byzantine army collapsed. Romanos was captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, and though he was released soon after, his humiliation led to civil war at home. In the chaos that followed, the empire lost most of Anatolia, its wealthiest and most vital region. For Byzantium, this was not merely a military loss, it was a national catastrophe. Anatolia had been the empire's breadbasket, its manpower base, and its strategic heartland. Without it, Byzantium was crippled. Refugees flooded into Constantinople. The empire's revenues shrank, and its armies weakened further. For the first time, the Byzantines were forced to look beyond their borders for help. That appeal for aid would have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. In 1095 CE, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing the Seljuk advance and desperate to reclaim lost lands, sent envoys to the west, to the Pope and the princes of Europe, asking for military assistance. The response was overwhelming. What began as a call for limited aid became the First Crusade, a massive wave of armed pilgrims who marched east, not only to help Byzantium, but to capture Jerusalem for Christendom. At first, the alliance worked. The Crusaders helped Alexios reclaim parts of Asia Minor and secure the empire's frontiers. Constantinople once again became the center of a world united, briefly, under the banner of the cross. But mistrust soon grew. The cultural and religious divide between Greek Orthodox Byzantines and Latin Catholic Crusaders deepened with every campaign. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as unruly and arrogant. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as deceitful and effeminate. The dream of unity crumbled into suspicion and rivalry. These tensions would reach their tragic climax in the early 13th century. In 1204 CE, during the Fourth Crusade, the unthinkable happened. Instead of marching to fight Islam, the Crusaders, manipulated by Venetian merchants and driven by greed, turned their armies against Constantinople itself. For 3 horrific days, the greatest Christian city on earth was plundered and burned. Churches were desecrated, holy relics stolen, and priceless works of art destroyed or looted. The Hagia Sophia, once the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world, was defiled as soldiers rode their horses through its marble halls. It was one of the darkest moments in European history. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, dividing Byzantine lands among themselves. The Byzantine nobility fled, founding small successor states such as the Empire of Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. For more than half a century, Constantinople remained under foreign rule, its empire shattered, its spirit broken. Yet, once again, Byzantium refused to die. In 1261 CE, the exiled Byzantines of Nicaea, led by Michael VIII Palaiologos, recaptured Constantinople and restored the empire. The city was a ruin, its population reduced, its wealth gone, but it lived again. The restoration marked a final, fragile revival. The Palaiologan dynasty ruled for nearly 2 more centuries, overseeing a remarkable cultural renaissance even as the empire's political power faded. Artists, scholars, and theologians flourished. Byzantine art reached new levels of emotional depth and spiritual intensity, influencing both the Italian Renaissance and Orthodox Christianity for generations. But politically, the empire had become a shadow of its former self, surrounded by enemies, with little land and few soldiers left to defend it. To the west, the Latin kingdoms and the rising power of Venice controlled much of the Aegean. To the east, a new Turkish power, the Ottoman Empire, was growing rapidly, conquering one territory after another. By the 15th century, the Byzantines were confined mostly to Constantinople and a few small territories in Greece. The once mighty empire of Constantine, Justinian, and Heraclius had dwindled to a single, fading city, but that city was still magnificent, still proud, still defiant. The final act of the Byzantine story was about to begin. The empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, that had survived plagues, invasions, and betrayal, would now face its ultimate enemy, one last siege, and an ending so tragic and heroic that it would echo through history forever. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer an empire in the grand sense of the word. Its once vast territories had vanished, its armies reduced to a handful of soldiers, its treasury nearly empty. Yet its capital, Constantinople, still stood, proud and unbroken. The city remained one of the marvels of the medieval world. Its massive Theodosian walls had defied siege after siege for nearly 1,000 years. Behind them, a small but determined people still called themselves Romans, heirs of an unbroken legacy stretching back to Augustus and Constantine. The final emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, ruled what little remained of Byzantium with courage and dignity. His realm had shrunk to the city itself and a few scattered territories in Greece, but his faith in the empire's destiny never wavered. He knew that a storm was coming, one unlike any the empire had faced before. To the east, the Ottoman Empire, led by the young and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, was rising in power. Mehmed was only 21, but his vision was immense. He sought to conquer Constantinople and make it the heart of his new empire, a bridge between East and West, Islam and Christendom. Where so many before him had failed, Mehmed was determined to succeed. In 1453 CE, he began preparations for what would become one of the most legendary sieges in history. The Ottoman army, over 80,000 strong, equipped with advanced artillery and vast resources, marched toward Constantinople. Among their weapons was the monstrous basilica cannon, capable of hurling massive stone balls that could shatter walls once thought indestructible. Inside the city, Constantine XI could muster barely 7,000 defenders, including a few hundred Genoese allies under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani. They knew the odds were hopeless, but they stood firm, bound by duty, faith, and history itself. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman bombardment began. For weeks, the cannons thundered day and night, shaking the city's ancient walls. The defenders patched the breaches as best they could, praying for divine intervention or reinforcements that would never come. Messages were sent to the west, pleading for aid, but the Latin kingdoms of Europe, divided and indifferent, offered only words. As the siege dragged on, the tension inside the city grew unbearable. Churches overflowed with people praying for a miracle. Processions wound through the streets carrying holy relics, including what was believed to be the true cross. Even those long divided by faith, Orthodox and Catholic, came together in a final act of unity. For that moment, all that mattered was survival. On the night of May 28th, the people of Constantinople gathered one last time in the Hagia Sophia. By candlelight, they prayed and wept, knowing that dawn would bring the end. Emperor Constantine XI attended the service, then rode out to his men and spoke words that would become immortal. God forbid that I should live as an emperor without an empire. With you, my brothers in arms, I will die defending the city. At dawn on May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Ottoman cannons roared, and wave after wave of soldiers stormed the walls. The defenders fought valiantly, Greeks, Italians, even monks, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Justiniani was mortally wounded, the defenses crumbled. As the gates fell, Constantine XI cast aside his imperial regalia and charged into the fray, vanishing into legend. The last Roman emperor died with sword in hand, fighting for the city of Constantine. When the battle ended, Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom, the city of emperors and saints, had fallen. For 3 days, Ottoman soldiers looted and plundered, as was the custom of conquest. Churches were desecrated, treasures stolen, and the great Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. But Sultan Mehmed II soon ordered the violence to cease. He entered the city in awe, marveling at its beauty, and proclaimed it the new capital of his empire, Istanbul, the city of Islam. With that act, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome and guardian of the East, was no more. Yet even in its fall, Byzantium's legacy endured. Its scholars, fleeing westward, carried with them the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, fueling the European Renaissance. Its art, theology, and architecture shaped the Orthodox world for centuries. The empire's spirit lived on in Russia, which came to see itself as the Third Rome, inheritor of the faith and mission of Constantinople. For over 1,100 years, the Byzantine Empire had stood, longer than any other empire in recorded history. It had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, crusades, and caliphates. It had survived plague, invasion, and civil war. And when it finally fell, it did so with defiance, courage, and unshakable faith. Today, the story of Byzantium is not just one of decline, but of endurance, a civilization that bridged the ancient and medieval worlds, preserving knowledge, art, and faith through centuries of chaos. From the marble halls of Constantinople to the golden domes of Orthodox churches, its spirit still echoes in every corner of the modern world. The empire is gone, but its light, the light of Byzantium, still burns. And if this story moved you, if the rise and fall of Byzantium taught you something about faith, power, and endurance, then don't let it fade away. Hit that like button to honor the legacy of those who stood till the very end. Subscribe for more untold chapters of history, stories of empires, kings, and civilizations that shaped our world. And tell me in the comments, which empire's story should I bring to life next? Because history never truly dies. It waits for those who remember.